By the end of this month, the U.S. Supreme Court will rule on two cases challenging affirmative action in college admissions. I'm Rosemary Miller here with Sydney Montgomery, the Executive Director and founder of Barrier Breakers. Thank you so much for joining me today, Sydney.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, with this U.S. Supreme Court having a conservative majority, it's likely that this ban on affirmative action will happen. So, how can colleges and universities build a diverse student body without affirmative action?
I think this is a great question, and it really also varies between different levels. So, when you look at the undergraduate level, there have been a number of articles and research around using economics as a proxy, not just using income, but starting to look at things like socioeconomic diversity of a neighborhood or family wealth, looking at first generation status. We've actually seen this work in places like California and Michigan, where they've already had some of these statewide bans, and the schools there have had to navigate building a diverse class without being able to explicitly look at race as a factor. When you look at the graduate level, whether that's law school or any of the other professional schools, you start to see a little bit of difference in strategy. You can't necessarily always rely on neighborhood income because students might be working in a place that doesn't necessarily reflect their diverse background. But so you'll have to maybe look at things a little bit more like first generation status. You'll have to look at essays. You'll have to look at maybe what students have overcome and their personal narratives to create other factors that won't necessarily hinge on race, but can still help you as you build a diverse class.
So, there are other factors also with applying to schools. So you have your GPAs, your essay, your resume. Why is it that affirmative action in particular is being targeted right now?
I think that where we're at is we are at a place where we are trying to build a class, or I think most universities are trying to build a class that represents the makeup of the country. But when you look at things like GPA and test scores, because of some of those systemic barriers to education that are baked in, you see large disparities along racial lines when it comes to Black student performance on standardized tests at the undergraduate and graduate level. Same thing with GPAs, that really factors into the rigor of schools. We know that private secondary schools and even private elementary schools really do factor into segregation, right? Those are not necessarily equally made up of white and Black students or Asian and Latino students. And some of those highly selective elementary and secondary schools produce and better prepare some of their students for selective college admissions. And so there is disparities all the way through the education system, starting at the preschool level. But what we do see is that certain groups feel like despite these systemic barriers, they're not given a fair shake because we're trying to, at this point, correct for some of the systemic wrongs. It makes people feel like we're living in a zero-sum arena. And that, I think, is why you start to see affirmative action be something that's targeted, because they don't like the fact that maybe some of the privilege that they've had on the backs of some of these systemic barriers is being reallocated.
So, could you tell me why is it significant that these two cases in particular were filed on behalf of Asian Americans when historically it's usually been white people on the other end?
That is a very tricky question. I think that, Asian American students are also minority students. However, they are overrepresented oftentimes in the undergraduate admissions process, not necessarily at the graduate level, which is really remember, but at undergraduate institutions, we do sometimes see an overrepresentation of Asian students relative to the population in this country. But I think it's one of those things where it's let's pit the minorities against each other, which tends to take some eyes and some focus off of really the history of white supremacy in this country and who is actually perpetuating some of these systemic barriers. It makes it a more complicated issue. It makes it an issue that's a little less white and black than, no pun intended, if it were a predominantly white group that were putting forth these challenges. I think there would be a different narrative and a different conversation in this country. But it is true that Asian American students do have other challenges in the undergraduate admission system that other races do not have. And some of those challenges aren't fair, right? But we need to create a landscape that is fair to Asian American students and also addresses the systemic harms that Black and Latino students have and Native American students have also had to face.
So do you think that this ban on affirmative action could impact other diversity efforts at colleges and universities?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, it is all a trickle down effect, right? And so one of the questions is, okay, well, can we, and we don't know until the ruling comes out, but are we allowed to even monitor the racial makeup of our class, even if we use race neutral measures for admissions? Now, whether that's allowed or not will have tremendous impact on whether there will be able to have some of these maybe diversity programs or buy-in programs or these pipeline programs. But I think it's really important to do it themselves. Then we have more support for non-organizations, college access and graduate school access, strengthen the applications of underrepresented or lower socioeconomic and racially minority students so that they can do better in these admissions processes. If you have a lower percentage of students in graduate school, then that's when you start to see the workforce look a little different, right? You'll have fewer minority lawyers and doctors and people as CEOs and who have gone to business school. So it really all does affect each other.
So as two Black people talking, would it now just make more sense for Black folks to go to HBCUs?
Yes, I would say that students should absolutely always be looking at HBCUs if they're Black, because HBCUs have always been known to help support students of color, not just Black students, in not just their academic rigor, but in a culturally competent way that supports their development as a person. And the alumni networks are very strong. But what I would say is that statistics have shown that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have higher upward mobility when they attend highly selective institutions. And that is something that cannot be, just overlooked, because when we think about getting a seat at the table, when we think about going into the workforce in high paying jobs, where you go, unfortunately, still matters when you're thinking about credibility as a Black person and being taken seriously and being paid your worth, right? So those are things that unfortunately we can't just ignore or say it doesn't matter. What I would call for is more support for HBCUs, stronger funding, stronger programs, really having the support so that HBCUs can have the pedigree that will allow the same door opening opportunities as those highly selective, predominantly white institutions.
As a Howard grad, I am all for that. So what would you tell minority students who are, they're rising seniors right now? What would you tell them to keep striving toward the school that they're applying for, the Harvards, the Yales, or maybe really just focus on the HBCUs?
I would say do both. I mean, especially if you're a rising senior, the reality is that some of this may not fully shake out before their application is read. Applications are due early action November 1, November 15th. That's just a couple months from now. But, I would say definitely if you're a junior that's building your college list, or someone, that's applying not this fall, but next fall, I would really create a diversified profile, and I'd ask hard questions, because every school is going to address this differently. And that's so important. And every state is going to address this differently. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself and ask, how is your school committed to increasing diversity with the current, Supreme Court rulings or with the current state law in place? How is this school committed to making sure that I have a community of peers that look like me, that understand my lived background, but also allow me to interact with others in a safe way that's culturally competent, and see what their answer is. Some schools are going to give great answers, and some schools might just say, oh, we don't know. And that's important for you to think about in your college decision.
Thank you so much for joining me today.